The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining the Oildex webinar with guest speaker Forrester. We still have a few people logging in, so I'm going to give just a couple of minutes in order for those people to make sure that they're on. While we do that, I'm just going to go over a couple of housekeeping items. All attendees are currently on mute. That's so that we can eliminate any background noise that we have. If you have any questions, please use the GoToWebinar control panel at the right-hand side of your screen. You can either ask a question in the question section, or you can send us a chat in the chat section. My name is Jennifer Beaupre. I'm with Oildex, and I will be monitoring all of those questions and making sure that I route those appropriately. Again, we're just going to get started in a couple of minutes because I do see that a lot of people are currently logging on. So thanks so much for joining us. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Okay, once again, thanks everybody for joining us. This is the Oildex webinar featuring guest speaker from Forrester. Industry experience matters in your procure-to-pay vendor. Today from Forrester, we are honored to have Andrew Bartels speaking, and he's going to go over this webinar for you. Again, if you have any questions, all attendees are on mute. If you could please enter your questions on the right-hand side of the screen in your GoToWebinar control panel. We will be monitoring questions and the chat function. And with that, Andrew, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And after I speak, Michael Ross from Oildex will be coming on and talking a little bit about what Oildex provides in the way of solution. So thank you for joining us today. I'm going to be talking about really the broader topic of procure-to-pay solutions and what is involved in them. But as sort of a major theme through that is the importance of industry experience in your vendor. Because we found that having a vendor who knows your industry is a very important consideration whenever you look at the solutions you might be looking for in terms of supporting your procure-to-pay or source-to-pay activities. So when we say source to pay or say procure to pay, we're talking about a set of activities, source to pay being a broader set, procure to pay being a somewhat narrower set. In the broader source to pay, the whole process starts logically with spend analysis, understanding what you're spending, where you're spending it, and where your opportunities to capture savings are. It then includes both supplier assessment and new supplier identification, which we identify collectively as being supplier risk and performance management. You then actually do sourcing events, which allow you to choose the vendor you want to work with. You then take that sourcing events, turn into contract. You then buy against that contract, or maybe not. And you then fulfill your order and get the receipt or record of that. And of course, you get the invoice and you process and payment, which feeds your spend analysis. And all that's connected, what's in the middle is supplier network services. Now we're shown in the blue delta here, or blue triangle, I guess, is the subset of that, which is really the procure-to-pay. Now, it really involves primarily procurement, order fulfillment, invoice processing, and the supplier network services, but it does touch on contract management because you often want to know what the contract data is. That's going to inform your purchasing. And there is a certain amount of analysis that flows out of the system in terms of where you're spending. But the key part of the procure-to-pay is that half that focuses on the procurement, the PO, the receipt, the invoice, and the supplier network services that connect those together. Now, we're going to focus today. Oops, I jumped too far. Sorry about that. I'm going to go back a little sensitive mouse. Okay, so when we talk about the specific products that are part of that procure-to-pay function, we're starting with procurement, the requisitioning, the approvals, the employee-facing catalog, the punch-out to suppliers, catalog management. Those are key features of procurement. Contract lifecycle management involves some activities that are outside of the scope, such as contract creation, But it does certainly involve the contract repository that's used to reference when a purchase has occurred or when the invoice is coming in to check to make sure that that's in compliance with the contract. Spend analysis, the broader category, involves all kinds of loading of spend data and so forth, but part of what we're talking about here would be some of the reports and analysis of your existing spending going to the system. The key point area we're going to focus on today is what we call electronic invoicing, also called electronic invoice presentment and processing, which is the EIPP. And this is really the heart of what we want to talk about today. That involves the capture of electronic invoice data, the automated matching of the invoice with the PO, the contract, and receipt, workflow to approve unmatched invoices, cash forecasting, discount management, and financing of receivables for suppliers. And this really is the heart of it. And then that supplier network services that allows delivery of electronic invoices and POs in the correct format, and increasingly with, irony, error checking. This we forgot to check our errors in this graphic, so apologies. But that kind of correction of that kind of typo errors is what is involved in error checking. Now, within this cycle, there are three critical documents that really underpin this process. There's the contract, which governs many transactions. It's basically what we agree to engage, what we're agreeing to buy from you and what you're agreeing to sell to us under what terms. There's a purchase order, which involves most, but not necessarily all transactions and what we want to buy. And then the most ubiquitous of all documents, the one that occurs everywhere, is the invoice. And it's hard to think of a transaction that does not involve an invoice. The only exceptions might be P-card paid ones. And again, there's the invoice at the end of that as well. So the invoice is in many ways the most ubiquitous product. And especially in an industry like oil and gas, you may find a situation where you have many more invoices than POs, because so many of the purchases may be part of a service relationship in which you have a vendor who is responsible for, let's say, keeping an oil well operating. And that vendor, under that agreement, may then acquire goods that they need, but then it's not part of the purchase order, but you see it as part of the invoice. So the invoice it plays a particularly large role within the oil and gas industry. Now, invoicing is perhaps more important than you might think. You may just think of the invoice as the document that you use in order to determine how much you're going to pay your supplier, but it actually plays an even bigger role than that. The invoice provides the source data for spend analysis. It's because, as I said, pretty much every degree of spending that you're doing is captured in the invoice. It gives you the most complete record of what you're spending, and therefore it's the most typical source data for full-fledged spend analysis. The invoice also gives you that indicator of contract compliance and supplier performance. It's the document that allows you at the end of the process to say, did the supplier actually, bill us for what we said we were going to be buying? Did they do so in conformity with the contract which specified what we're supposed to be paying? Does that invoice reflect the supplier's performance? So the invoice plays an important role in contract compliance and in assessing supplier performance. It also impacts the supplier willingness to do business with you, because if you don't process the invoice correctly and don't pay them, especially, you have unhappy suppliers who may go so far as sue you for lack of payment. And even if they don't go that far, which hopefully they don't, they still may be unhappy because there are issues. They don't know where the invoice is, don't know what's being paid, how much got paid. So processing it effectively and quickly actually goes a long way to keeping your suppliers happy with you and willing to do business with you. And in many cases, it provides a source of savings, because certainly many contracts with suppliers may include certain defined discounts that you are eligible for if you pay before a certain date. And increasingly, we're starting to see it being utilized around what's called dynamic discounting, where the supplier literally invoice by invoice can determine what kind of a discount they're prepared to accept for what type of payment terms. So it expands it from the contract-based discount to a much broader base of it. So e-invoicing And the whole invoice process is a very critical part of the whole procure-to-pay or source-to-pay process. Now, when we talk about e-invoicing, we're really talking about 3 steps. I'm just going to click one more to get all those steps in here. So the first step is to receive electronic invoice, or more precisely, electronic invoice data. Because receiving an invoice paper invoice is a very manual process. You want as much as possible to get away from paper and be able to just handle the electronic invoice data. Now that may include an image of the invoice that you might review, but it's really the electronic invoice data that you have. And then the second step is to validate that. And there are 2 aspects of validation. One is an automated matching of a PO to the invoice to the PO, to the receipt, to the contract. If it all matches, then it's approved and goes through. But in many cases, especially if there's no PO, you may need to have that invoice routed to the purchaser for their review to make sure it's accurate, to make sure that the invoice reflects the price and the quantity and the delivery you expected. And again, that's where e-invoicing provides that workflow and the tracking of those requests to make sure that they are responded to in a timely fashion. They don't sit in somebody's email box or get lost there, and that you therefore can process quickly. The first and second step really are what lead to quick and rapid invoice validation. And that leads them to a third source of value, which is where you can get creative around payment and funding options, where those ability to capture early payment discounts, for example, to understand through reports what are discounts that we're entitled to what is the invoice that's received, what do they mean in terms of what we'll have to have cash on hand to pay, and so cash forecasting. And one of the invoices that, quite frankly, we may want to help our supplier out by funding them, either through a discounting fashion or through an actual helping them find a loan to tide them over until they actually get paid. So that's the 3 elements of that: the electronic data receipt, the validation of the invoice, and then the reporting and analysis that allow you to get creative around maximizing the value from your invoices. So we'll break these down quickly into what's involved in each of them and some of the benefits of those. And I apologize for those of you who know this, but for those who don't, it's important to kind of have the landscape in place. So in terms of that first step, electronic invoices, what you're really looking towards is totally replacing paper invoices with electronic invoices. Now, many of your suppliers may already be fully prepared to deliver electronic invoices, and that's great. You want to take advantage of that. Others may be interested in using a mechanism that can extract invoice data from their billing system and pull it via the network into your system so you get it there electronically. Others may be very interested in using what's called a PO flip, where the supplier receives the PO and with a quick click of a button, turns it back into a PO that gets submitted back to you, and it comes back that way. And for other suppliers who still insist upon mailing paper invoices, then you may still need to utilize some mechanism for having those invoices mailed to a post office box for opening, scanning, and capture, or to have some kind of an email where it comes in and using OCR within the application to convert that into electronic data. But what you really are looking for in a solution is a vendor who can provide this full portfolio of mechanisms to allow you to receive at the end of the day all electronic invoices, even if your suppliers don't deliver it that way. And of course, from you as a processor of invoices, there's major savings here. It means you can eliminate all the cost, typically staff cost, of having people manually open envelopes, manually key in the paper invoice data into your system. That can all go away, and it can be a big source of savings. But equally important, it also sets up the capability for doing the automated invoice validation. Because you have all electronic invoice data, you can now start to match it with the PO and the contract data. And that's the second stage of the process, where you're using the electronic invoice data and the PO data and other data to automatically match those and end up with a validated invoice that is now acceptable to pay. But as we said, you will probably find a high proportion of invoices, and particularly in oil and gas, a very high proportion of invoices that have no PO. And you'll want to have a workflow that can route those exception items to the right manager for review and approval. Now, the benefits, it means you can cut your AP department costs because you're reducing the invoicing, the invoices that need manual entry, review, and approval. Again, that saves you staff costs. It can improve the AP department efficiency because the system will automatically send to the right person the invoice for them to review. It can make sure that that person is notified and that is reminded to respond back in a timely way, and capture the status of it so you know exactly where that invoice is. And when the supplier calls you, or even better, you can alert the supplier to let them know that the invoice is in process. It will be, it will be approved in the next 2 days. The invoice has already been approved. All that tracking is actually a lot of benefit of an e-invoicing solution, and it benefits both you. It also benefits the supplier because they can get those alerts and tell them exactly where the status is. They don't have to call you up. Now, the third stage around getting finance all depends upon having that fast, rapid, accurate validation of invoices layered on top with a set of analytics that you can use to summarize results. And with that in place, then you can have a system that establishes rules for which invoices do you want to seek to pay early so you can capture discounts. Which ones do you want to pay late to maximize float? It also allows you then build linkages into banks and financial institutions for financing. For example, to sell invoices to banks who want to buy those so you can get paid more, that you can help your suppliers out, or other funding options for payment of valid invoices so that you can make sure that if you need to borrow to pay, you can have access to that tied to the invoice. The benefits here, you avoid late payment penalties. You get systematic capture of early payment discounts. You get improved cash management. You get better, more automated access to financing options, and you get increasing what's called dynamic discounting. So those are all the reasons for doing this. Now, you do have to, though, recognize that as you're putting this together, there are going to be different sponsors that you will need to have and different sequence of what you want to be involved in. So the first stage, of course, involves that implementing electronic invoice on, and here the sponsors going to tend to be the head of the AP department. Now, the second stage, where you're matching this with the POs and invoices, is often where the CPO comes in, the Chief Purchasing Officer, because you want to make sure that that CPO knows that when they're collecting and sending those electronic POs, the purchase orders, that they'll be able to match with the invoices and get the benefit from that. And your corporate treasurer is going to be the one who's most interested in creative funding and payment options. So now that deals with the internal process, but this is, you still have the task of how do you get that information, that invoice into you. And here's what many firms traditionally have had. The invoices coming in by mail or email or by fax. The invoices coming in through a portal where the suppliers log in the portal and manually entering data, whether that's through a manual login or whether it's through a PO flip mechanism. Or if you have EDI connections, you might be getting that through that pipeline. These are all kind of one-to-one pipes that allow that to happen. But there's actually a better way, because that, I'm just going to build this out quickly, that one-to-one creates this whole spaghetti of one-to-one connections, which are costly and painful to maintain. The alternative is to have a supplier network through which any buyer connects in once that network, and then they can receive send in POs from to their suppliers or receive back from their suppliers the invoice. And that supplier network eliminates the spaghetti of many one-to-one connections and makes it easier for you because you've got one mechanism to connect to. And for the suppliers, although the suppliers, quite frankly, might have to connect to several networks because they may have buyers in different networks, but still, even connecting to 2 or 3 or 4 networks is going to be better than having to connect to one, do multiple connections to multiple customers. So certainly buyers can benefit because of one connection, but even suppliers can benefit even if they still end up with 3, 4, half a dozen connections. It's still better than hundreds of connections they have to worry about. So with supplier networks, there are a certain set of things you look for as well. And this is part of what you're seeking as you are pursuing a solution. You want to have an existing network connected suppliers. It's better for you if you're using a vendor who's already connected to most of the suppliers that you do business, because you don't have to worry about getting them onboarded. Of course, there always will be suppliers who are not part of that network. So you want to make sure that they have nice tools that can bring your suppliers onto the network easily and inexpensively. And that means also tools to message those suppliers and to help them get enabled to get set up and to use the network. You want that network to be able to support a variety of different XML standards. Some companies have their own XML standards they use. Others may have different ones. Suppliers may have their own. So you want to be able to support whatever XML standard you use, whether or not your suppliers do, and be able to convert them. You may want to also have the ability to handle not just electronic POs, but also fax delivery, because there may be some small suppliers who don't have electronic order management system, but they do want to get it by fax or perhaps email. And so from an outbound PO perspective, you want to have that as well. And then you want the ability to receive those electronic invoices from the suppliers, rather than deliver them or in the preferred XML format that you've got. So you want to integrate both your procurement system and your invoice system into the supplier network. And we won't talk much about it, but in certain cases where you're dealing with catalogs, then you want to be able to have that supplier manage those catalogs for you. Now, one of the key questions we see increasingly, in fact, I've had inquiries from clients in the last couple of days, should we get our e-invoicing solution standalone as part of a supplier network, or as part of an e-purchasing suite, a suite that governs all of the products in there? And certainly it's very tempting today for firms to want to utilize a full suite that covers all of the products. That looks nice, that looks helpful, because you feel, okay, one vendor providing one set of products, that's one throat to choke, to use that colorful metaphor. It also means that you may have a common user interface across the applications. Maybe the data can be more easily shared. What's wrong with getting an e-purchasing suite? Well, the answer is several things. That common user interface is great if everybody is using the same sets of products. But if, for example, you have a e-invoicing product that's only used by your HP department, while your procurement product is being utilized by all employees, well, those are different user groups. And having a common user interface is not a great thing. Having a common data model, integrated data flow, sounds great, but in the case of POs and invoices, you don't really need real-time connection between those. One of the realities of the business world is your PO may take place, 3, 4, 10 days before the invoice comes in. So you don't necessarily have to have real-time integration. You may just be able to have, here's all our POs in the day, put in a batch file, send it over to the other to the invoice system, pull it in that way. But so it looks great, but maybe you won't need it that way. There may well be a lower cost from one vendor. That looks attractive. We buy the whole suite. Our cost may be lower. But what happens if you don't use all the modules? And you think, well, I actually may have overpaid because we bought modules, but they're really not quite so good. And that one throat to choke is certainly attractive, but hopefully you don't want to choke the supplier. You want that to be the last recourse rather than the first recourse. That's why there's liabilities. Not all the products in the suite are equally good. A vendor might have a great procurement, a great e-invoicing product, but not be terribly good at sourcing. Different stakeholders will have different requirements. We identified already when talking about invoicing, the stakeholders like the CPO, like the CFO, and like the head of AP. Those folks may have different requirements, and your suite vendor may not meet the requirements. You maybe get more functionality than you actually need. If you buy a full suite but you don't really need it, then again, you're overpaying. And especially important, the suite vendor may not be right for your industry, because suite vendors often, not always, but are often building solutions that are designed to work for any industry with lowest common denominator functionality. But if you're an industry like oil and gas, you may want someone who actually knows your industry, knows the ins and outs, knows the nuances of it. So we're not saying suites are bad, because there are certainly many cases when they make a lot of sense. But we are saying don't be lured by the siren song of suites, because there were many reasons not to use suites. And so when we go back to this, so that's why when you look at this suite landscape, you'll actually find a whole variety of different suites. You'll find some vendors who combine the types of tools that are used by the sourcing and vendor management team: spend analysis, supplier risk performance management, e-sourcing, contract lifecycle management. That could be a good suite to use. You may find other vendors who give you that full broad suite, but here's where I get a little bit nervous, because they may not be good everywhere. You may find other vendors who focus on the procure-to-pay side of things, just the invoicing, supplier network, and procurement. And you may find some who provide the three core things that a CPO needs: procurement, e-sourcing, and contract lifecycle management. But that doesn't really meet the needs of the CFO or the AP department. So just remember, as you're looking at suites, there also are sub-suites. You've got layers of suites: broad suites, narrow suites, and different vendors will position in different ways. And think about which of these really meets your needs the best. Excuse me. So, and this is one of the key points here, is the different stakeholders that are involved. Certainly within e-invoicing solutions, the two key stakeholders are going to be the CPO and the CFO. I mentioned the head of AP, but AP typically reports into the CFO. So in a sense, it's a sub-constituent under the CFO. But other products like supplier network services will have different types of roles that may be involved in other industries. Like CIO is going to be interested in terms of data exchange. The supply chain head will be interested in terms of not just POs and invoices, but maybe using that network for various supply chain documents like logistics or transportation scheduling. And contract lifecycle management will actually have lots of different stakeholders depending upon who utilizes who needs the contracts. So that's why another reason why the suite idea may not pan out if you've got a lot of these different demands upon you. So what I mentioned earlier is the importance of industry expertise. And here's some of the ways in which it really matters. Certainly in procurement, understanding what goods are typically purchased and supporting special rules and regulations that might govern those purchases. There might be environmental ratings, regulations that require that certain devices comply with environmental laws around performance. In the case of e-invoicing, we know in the oil and gas industry that there's a specific document format called PIDEX. And so you want to make sure the vendor can support PIDEX and support other aspects of the processing of things, such as what happens in a lot of oil field services, where there may be no PO, but instead it's an invoice that's tied to a broader agreement around delivery of certain types of services. A supplier network that's built in your industry that already is connected to suppliers in your industry is much more attractive than one that's generic and only has a few existing suppliers in the industry involved in that. Spend analysis that is based upon the most common product taxonomies used in your industry matters. And CLM can matter in terms of what are standard contract terms and conditions used in your industry. So industry expertise is a often underrated aspect that should go into any thinking that you do around you're looking for solutions, whether more narrowly focused on e-invoicing or whether looking more broadly at the adjoining products of a source-to-pay or a procure-to-pay suite. And here's an example of where that industry expertise might matter. It's within oil field services. Now, within oilfield services, there's generally a process where you define the services that are going to be provided. You choose a vendor and you set the scope, pricing, and timing of service provided. And that's usually going to be a master agreement that you have. Then you're going to actually engage that service provider to initiate a specific task of work. And then you want to manage that service provider's engagement performance to make sure that you're getting what you want. You're going to process the invoice and pay the vendor. Now, this is great, but you also want the ability to fill and make sure that you are getting the full value you're getting. Now, other products may play a role in this. That defining the oil field service may involve some degree of spend analysis, may involve some e-sourcing. The vendor itself may result in a contract, as we said, that's going to govern that relationship. The engagement may be taken through an execution that may use e-procurement or may use other mechanisms to actually happen. But then you want to manage that service provider, typically referring back to the contract. And of course, you want to make sure these are linked together because you don't want to pay an invoice if you had poor work performance. You don't want to pay the invoice if it doesn't agree with the contract. So, having that way of linking the invoice back to what the contract specifies, back to the actual record of performance, are critical things to make sure that you're getting the value that you pay, you expect to pay for an oilfield services agreement. So here are my recommendations before I turn it over to Michael. E-purchasing products are a great tool. They have and continue to provide tremendous help to firms in allowing to gain control of the purchasing process, bring in increasing savings, better suppliers, and greater efficiency in their whole sourcing and purchasing and invoicing process. But e-purchasing products are a broad portfolio of products, and it's very tempting to use a purchasing suite to get these all together in one integrated solution. And there are going to be a number of situations where, in fact, that makes sense for firms, especially firms that may operate in one geography, one set of organizations, one line of business, and where their invoicing activities are relatively straightforward. But there are counter forces against this, including the fact you've got different stakeholders, and those different stakeholders will want different things from the purchasing suite. So what may lead you, rather than buying a full suite, is buying a sub-suite, a specialist suite. It may lead you to buy best of breed. So while you may be tempted to buy a purchasing suite, as I said, it might be the right decision. It's important to be open to the possibility that you may actually want to buy parts of a suite rather than a full suite. And as you're doing so, spend a lot of time thinking about and looking at the industry expertise of the vendor you're dealing with. Because industry expertise really, really matters. And so that expertise should well tilt you towards vendors who have that expertise built into products for your industry, because they're going to help you out more than a more generic solution that has little or no expertise in your industry. So with that, I'm going to say thank you for my section, and we're going to pass it over to Michael to pick up on his section.
Thank you, Andy. Good afternoon, everybody. I am Michael Ross. I've been a member of the OpenInvoice team here at Oildex for the last 7 years. And today I want to talk to you about Oildex, our experience working with the oil and gas industry, and the benefits of using OpenInvoice on the Oildex network. So Oildex was founded in 1999 by oil and gas professionals. Our solutions enable the electronic processing and exchange of data between royalty owners, banks and trusts, joint venture partners, and upstream operators, field service providers, as well as midstream transporters and haulers. Our automation solutions are purpose-built for the oil and gas industry, providing workflows that simplify the industry's complex processes between partners, as well as between remote field sites and the office. Workflow automation and automated compliance checking enables the industry's rigorous regulatory requirements and helps to manage spend control. As part of our commitment to the oil and gas industry, Oildex is a member of the PIDEX board and PIDEX's Field Ticket Standards Committee. In addition, OpenInvoice, our e-payable solution, is PIDEX compliant. OpenInvoice is a fully integrated solution that automatically reconciles and validates invoices to field tickets, purchase orders, and pricing agreements. This automation has allowed customers to realize $45.6 million in early pay discounts. We are one of the largest oil and gas business networks with 61,000 suppliers and 212 buyers, including operators such as Anadarko, Encana, Noble Energy, Statoil, and XTO, to name a few. In addition to our large oil and gas buyer community, OpenInvoice and the Oildex network are the suppliers' network of choice. In a recent survey, suppliers preferred Oildex 5 times more than the nearest competitor and 7 times more than the average of all competitors. As part of the Oildex network, OpenInvoice allows buyers and suppliers to easily collaborate with each other through messaging, notification, and real-time status visibility. Suppliers can create pre-populated invoices from purchase orders and field tickets to reduce data entry, improve accuracy, and increase compliance. The automated reconciliation, validation, and compliance checking helps buyers reduce their invoice processing time, allowing them to earn more early pay discounts and suppliers to get paid faster. In 2016, Oildex launched OpenInvoice Field Ticket, which has significantly improved the reconciliation of oil and gas invoices by eliminating the hard-to-manage and error-prone paper field tickets. Data is captured, reviewed, and approved electronically on-site as the work is done, and invoices are automatically reconciled and validated to the electronic ticket data, allowing your field supervisors, accounts payable, and the suppliers to focus on the business that matters and not the paperwork. Collaboration between buyers and suppliers is further enhanced when the buyer manages pricing agreements or the contracts electronically with OpenInvoice. A digital contract embraces change, ensuring all parties are working with that correct version of the contract, whether it be the supplier who's creating an invoice or accounts payable that's reconciling that invoice to the pricing agreement. OpenInvoice supports complex pricing, allowing for price changes based on date, unit of measure, a qualifier, and quantity thresholds, allowing for variations in price depending on when the work is done and where the work is done. And then finally, invoices are automatically reconciled to the pricing agreement, and OpenInvoice alerts users when mismatches occur or an invoice item is off contract. That's both the suppliers at the time of submission as well as accounts payable who is reviewing the invoice. And this saves the time for the accounts payable team to actually haul out that paper contract and manually do a line-by-line reconciliation. They just need to focus on the exceptions that are presented through the alerts. When OpenInvoice is connected to a buyer's procurement system and a supplier's order management system, approved purchase orders are automatically transmitted from the buyer to the supplier. Formal acknowledgments allow buyers to know the purchase order has been received and accepted by that supplier, removing the guesswork and follow-ups. If a supplier needs to modify the terms of the purchase order, they can propose changes, which are transmitted directly to the buyer's procurement system for review and approval. OpenInvoice allows buyers to configure the system to meet their coding and approval needs. Business rule configuration ensures that coding is correct and the right person performs the right financial approval. And this can be done through the linking of cost objects, general ledger codes, and assigning those codes to your different approval levels. Productivity is further improved through workflow automation. And OpenInvoice provides 3 types of automation. The first is coding automation, which facilitates receiving pre-coded invoices without requiring the supplier to enter additional data at the time of submission. This can be accomplished by copying coding from previously reviewed or approved documents in the procure-to-pay process, such as your previously approved purchase orders or the approved field tickets. Another way that this is accomplished is by OpenInvoice applying coding based on historical data, and so the same product and service from the same supplier will automatically receive the coding that was used the last time that product and service was seen. The second type of automation that OpenInvoice supports is compliance and reconciliation. This eliminates the manual review and comparison of invoices to source documents, such as field tickets, purchase orders, and pricing contracts. Exceptions are identified by alerts. So this allows the team to focus really on just those exceptions, and they don't have to spend time redoing the work the supplier did to reconcile invoices to these documents, allowing them to be processed faster. And then finally, the third form of automation is workflow automation, where the invoices can be automatically approved or disputed based on the compliance and reconciliation results. So for example, if an invoice is identified as over-fulfilling a purchase order or not complying with the pricing terms of a contract, that can be automatically disputed and sent back to the supplier with details about the issue, and it doesn't have to come into your team, and the workflow of the accounts payable doesn't have to spend time processing it. Similarly, if successful matches are identified and you put in a dollar threshold, you define a threshold, and so it's from a low-value invoice from a trusted supplier, you can have those invoices automatically approved and processed without having to have somebody from your team click a button. When you connect OpenInvoice to your reporting system, you gain real-time spend visibility with the field ticket data that's captured at the field site, and you can improve your price compliance by analyzing the spend compliance and contract coverage with individual suppliers, allowing you to target specific suppliers to add additional products to the existing contracts and or work with that supplier to improve compliance with your contracts. You can also realize more early pay by reviewing your invoice processing cycle times and making strategic targeted improvements, because you have the data that tells you at which point in the process delays may have been occurring. A few final thoughts. Use OpenInvoice as the gatekeeper and protect your ERP from invoices that are not valid and or do not have valid data. When you integrate your procurement and invoicing systems, you can facilitate automation, reconciliation, and compliance across the documents and ensure that invoice is correct before it flows to your ERP. Define workflow based on the presence of source documents such as field ticket, purchase orders, and pricing contracts, and use the automatic compliance and reconciliation alerts and process to help reduce fraud, reduce administrative load, and improve your data quality. Finally, using OpenInvoice and the Oildex network ensures enhances collaboration between you and your supplier and improves the relationships you have with your suppliers. At this time, Jennifer, I'd like to turn it back over to you to handle any questions that may have come in.
Thank you, Michael and Andrew. So if anybody has any questions, please submit them in the chat button or in the questions section on the right-hand side of your screen in the GoToWebinar control panel. If anybody has any questions, again, please send them in via the chat function or underneath the control panel. Okay, the first question is, how does Oildex OpenInvoice fit in with a Procure-to-Pay system?
I'll take that question. So by connecting your procurement system to OpenInvoice, that allows you to handle your purchase order approval process in your procurement system, and then send those approved purchase orders to your suppliers through the OpenInvoice network. And what that does is it then allows the suppliers to review and receive all of the purchase orders from all of their buyers one way, and they can connect their order system and receive the purchase orders electronically into their system. And then when the supplier creates the invoice and they either reference the purchase order or they flip the purchase order, so they create an invoice directly from it, it copies all of the details from that purchase order to the invoice, it tracks the fulfillment, and it ensures that the invoice is compliant with that purchase order. And then when the invoice flows back out to your invoice management system, you have the purchase order references directly on that invoice as well.
Okay, thank you. The second question is, why would a supplier want to invoice through OpenInvoice instead of using their own system?
So by invoicing through OpenInvoice, they can take advantage of the data validation checking, the compliance checking, and the ease of use or the automation that comes into play where they can copy data from previously approved records. So what this does is it simplifies the process for that supplier. It eliminates the need for them to do printing and postage and send that stuff and send the invoices through the mail to the supplier. And it provides them with real-time status visibility. So if there are delays in the invoice processing cycle, or they want to know where an invoice is at, they can sign into OpenInvoice and at any time check the current status of it. Finally, if the buyer has added payment information or sends payment information back to OpenInvoice, the supplier gets notified when that payment is made and when they can expect to see that payment information.
Okay, thank you. Again, anyone, if you have questions out there, please put them in the question function in the GoToWebinar control panel or under the chat function. The next question is for Andrew. How does Forrester see niche networks fitting into the overall source-to-pay solution set?
Well, I guess there are two ways of interpreting that question. One is niche products. The other is, niche verticals. The way that we see niche products, as I said, is a coexistence one. I think our view is that you want to, you do want, if possible, to have the fewest number of vendors, and therefore having solutions that are most tied together. But you only want to have that if you can gain the key requirements of adequate or even above adequate functionality, good functionality in the specific applications. And in our view is that in certain cases that specific functionality is so important that you would often be willing to accept some of the inconveniences of having more than one vendor or having multiple vendors in space. So it's, in our view, integration and common user interface is a consideration, but it's not the only consideration. It needs to be weighed against the other variables I talked about, like specific functionality, as well as particularly industry expertise in making a decision as to how much of a suite you go with versus how much of a mix of suite versus specialist products you go with.
Okay, great. Again, anyone, if you have questions out there, please submit them in the question function in the control panel. Our next question is, you mentioned industry experience. Why is that important, especially for oil and gas?
Well, I think that both between what Michael talked about and what I talked about, and certainly Michael has much more expertise within this industry than I do, we identified a whole set of considerations that where industry expertise comes to bear. I think one of the reasons that is especially important in the oil and gas industry is because the whole process by which firms utilize and work with service providers is very complex. and has very unique ways in which responsibility is assigned between the customer and the supplier. And therefore, having a solution, both from a procurement and from an invoicing sense, that understands and reflects and is built around those unique characteristics means you get better performance. You get better results than you would if you just tried to use a generic solution for that.
And if I can just add to that, with oil and gas industry, and particularly in the upstream industry with the distributed operations where you've got the work being done out at a remote field site, but the invoice is being processed in a head office in a major city or a major center, that communication from the field to the office is a very complex process. And so by understanding and having that industry experience of how that whole process flows and how the information flows from the supplier to the field, back to the supplier, and back into the office, allows a company such as Oildex and our OpenInvoice platform to tailor the solutions and the workflow to those unique needs of that distributed operation. It also means that we build the data that's captured by the system to make sure that we're capturing the data that is important for this industry, so that the industry has the data they need to do the analysis and reporting without having to rekey a bunch of stuff. It's all captured in one spot at one time. A good example of that would be with our field ticket system and the expansion of that to include water hauling tickets that captures additional data elements specific to a water hauling service that allows both buyers and suppliers to do the analysis and reporting that's necessary for regulatory purposes.
Okay, so that's all the questions that we have for today. Any final comments, Andrew?
No, I think we've pretty much covered everything that we can cover in this time frame. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you folks, and I hope that this has been helpful. And please feel free to reach out to Forrester if you've got additional questions, and of course, reach out to Oildex.
Thank you. Michael, any additional thoughts?
No, that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining. As you can see on the screen, if you need any more information or have questions for these panelists, please contact us at info@oildex.com. We appreciate your time today. Thank you everyone and have a great day.